Welcome to the channel, everybody. Today we are looking at the Scaletrains.com GP30. To be honest with you, this review is going to be a little bit different than I have done some in the past. This is a little more rushed than I would have liked to have, but there's some things that have come to light on these that I want to get out there, since these are a fairly new release and this could influence some people making some purchase decisions going forward. So I ended up getting three different models that you can see in front of me. The Union Pacific GP30 and the Slug unit are both sound equipped, and the Stealth version is not. It was ordered as a DC unit. All right, we're going to change up how I do the visual quality of these things moving forward a little bit here. This definitely requires a bit more detail, so I'm trying a macro lens with a little bit different setup here, so bear with me and hopefully this works out. Starting from the front of the unit, notice that first off we have a Microtrains coupler pre-installed. Little bit concerned with the length of the brake hose on this, which we'll get to in the runability section of these units, but it is nice to see these couplers. They are much more functional for switching than the older, Scaletrain specific couplers, so good to see that. Also, the scale, rust color is also a nice addition. When it comes to the front end here, the MU hoses are separately applied. They are a type of rubber, very fragile but well attached. You don't have to worry about breaking them off. This is a enthusiast grade model, so it is to be handled a little different than, say, a normal engine. So that's something to be keeping in mind. The color of all of the plastic components is very consistent throughout, which is nice to see. No painted handrails or steps, but that is part of the prototypical accuracy of this unit. Normally I like to see that. In this particular case, it is not a requirement. As we move back a little bit, and we will turn this unit to the side in a moment, let me slightly make an adjustment to my focus here. Hopefully you can see that each window has a molded in windshield wiper, and all of the hand grabs on this unit are hyper thin and very well applied. They're solid, that you don't have to worry about them coming off. Also, we have a very unusual looking shade. This is a period correct piece of equipment here, and unfortunately with the lighting that's required to get the macro lens to work with this, hopefully that you can see in my pre-review run, the separately lit number boards is a nice feature. You can dim them way down so they're a little more scale. A lot of units that have a bright forward LED will sometimes overpower the number boards, and it almost looks like the number boards are brighter than the actual headlights themselves. So in most applications, you can kind of see the headlight working here. It's currently parked, so it is in the dim mode, but it is bright enough, in my opinion, to be relatively scale accurate. Not as bright as, say, a TCS unit, but good enough for good scale quality. Turning to the side of the unit, you can see how well this is put together. Every line and body panel is nice and straight. There's no odd gaps, no shifting in the plastic. It is probably one of the best put together models I've seen. Also, the shell is plenty thick enough that there's no light bleed through. There was some older Scaletrain unit that required some interior painting. When you would flip the lights on, it would actually show through some of the plastic. Not the case on these. They are well put together. We have separately applied detail around the windows, a nice clear window, as well as an interior that is visible to anyone just looking at it, which is a nice addition on these models. It's something that's becoming more and more common, and I like to see it. All of the vent work, latches, and again, body panels are crisp, small, and well put together. All of the words are easily legible and well applied, and you can't see any edges to, say, a decal or a paint line. So honestly, when it comes to the quality of the paint that's on this, it is top notch. Something that you will see on these units that is maybe less common in its competitor, say the Atlas four-axle units. The trucks are incredibly stiff. The plastic that they are made out of is strong enough that there is always a consistent amount of wheel flange hanging out the bottom. This is not necessarily the case for other models you'll find. It can look funny on certain models where you have one flange hanging a little bit lower because the plastic's warped. Don't have to worry about on these. All three of the examples I have are super solid, well put together. Also, the brake not the brake detail, the suspension detail right here. These springs are just immaculately put together, and you can tell that there's spacing all around it. It's not like they're just kind of molded and you kind of tell it's a spring. It's the nicest I've ever seen. These are some of the best trucks I've seen on a 4-axle unit. Moving further back, obviously we have the upper GP30 long hood. Obvious spotting for anybody who's at all aware of these things. They're an interesting model, or an interesting unit for that matter. I've never seen anything else like them. I'm pretty sure this was kind of a one-off for EMD. So it's an interesting piece to have in any collection, and so I do like having these. And I have a BNSF one. I think it's a GP39M reclassification, but same idea. Neat addition to any layout. The walkways here, the texture to the, and I don't know that I can get this on camera per se, but the walking texture on there is hyper fine detail. Almost invisible to the eye unless you look really close. Honestly, it's kind of next level when it comes to the tread pattern that you would see on these walkways. Moving down a little bit further, I always like to see painted fill for fuel tanks. Air tanks are nice and separately applied there, and you can see some hose work. And then on some of the SD40s, we had some issues with the tanks hanging too low. I did not have that problem on my particular layout. This is at a very scale height, and I would be curious if in decent elevation changes, if you might run into the potential for the rear or the front of the tank to drag in certain applications. So your mileage may vary there. I don't have any grades on my layout anymore to test that. So something to be aware of. As we move to the back of the unit, I will show you this on the B unit a little bit better. It's harder to see the sanding units, but there are hoses that hang down, which is a feature that I like to see, but I wish they were removable. It makes breakdown and reassembly of these units incredibly difficult, and we will talk about that on the CSX unit when we get there. But there are 8 different tubes for the sanders to go down to your wheels, which is very cool. It's the first I've seen other than the SD40s. I like the feature. I wish it was more easily removable without completely breaking them off the model. And then when we get to the back here, its own individual horn, well applied. The level of detail we are getting out of the radiators from Scaletrains now is immaculate. Separate fans inside there, hyper thin grill detail. Love every part of that. And then, of course, the side intake vents right here look very scale. You could even do a little bit of a wash on there, and I bet you these things would just absolutely pop. At the rear, again, we have all separately applied hand grabs, hyper thin, well attached. Excellent body panel detail all the way through. And then the rear pilot has, I'm really not sure what these are for. I'm sure it's for some sort of MUing function or possibly remote work. I'm not sure, but also lit number boards in the rear that are function controlled. I forgot to mention that. You can actually turn these on and off, and I'll get to how I did that. And of course, we have all of our MU hoses. Just a flawless looking model front to back. Okay, and now I have the slug unit. For anyone who doesn't know, This is, I believe, the first production slug that I have come across in my lifetime. There may be some other ones out there. It's possible Fox Valley had some. I've never had my hands on them, but this is the first readily available production slug. So personally, I just had to have one. Also, it being the GP30 style top, long hood, is an interesting feature and makes it quite the talking piece for any collection, especially for the enthusiast. Custom, everything front to back, different handrails, all that type of stuff. Hopefully right here you can see there's just a little more space back under these compared to the mother model. You can definitely see the sanding tubes right there and right there. Very easy to see. Everything that I had to say about its mother unit holds true here. But if you're curious, it is just a fine unit. So now I'm going to show you what I'm talking about when I come to these sanding hoses. They are applied right along the underside of the body here, and they are glued in place so they can't be easily removed. But when it comes to the CSX version, since this is a stealth unit, there's no prime mover. All of the body panels are filled in and only the pertinent ones are left, just like the actual prototype. All different body detail. Very well put together. Painted handrails and steps as it should be. Just gorgeous front to back. I love this model. I really hope that I can get it running a little bit better. It is quite the talking piece when you see it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about electronics before we get up close and start talking about the installation of these electronics here. The Union Pacific units came with Locksound V5s pre-installed. Personally, I found the sound to be satisfactory. To run with some of my other models that are kind of the same type of prime mover, I did step the volume down just a little bit. I found them to be very adequate at their stock position. The one problem with some of these smaller units and their smaller speakers, there's not a whole lot of bass low end. And if you were in a train show type of situation, large club, it may be difficult to hear these things at run at those scales. So that's something to be aware of. I will go ahead and power them on now. We'll do the startup sequence. Give it the horn. And then we'll do drive hold and just run them up to run 8 here. Okay, so that is what they sound like for the basic features. Again, Locksound V5, so all the things that I love about Locksound are available on these units. There's nothing special about the Scaletrain stuff. I'm sure they provide stuff to ESU for their kind of open source file system, but these are all available online to everyone to use in the silent position. Horn, bell, that type of stuff is all available to you, so that's something I prefer. I bring it up in all my reviews where this is a thing. I like having access to some of the fun features that a kid would like without having the prime movers active, so that's always appreciated. When it comes to some of the dissatisfaction I'm starting to have with some companies is they will do tuning for functions, but we're not getting tuning for motor control out of the box. And for the price point that these come in at, I think that they should run better out of the box than they do. There is tuning that's required. I did have to adjust some CVs to get these to function a little better at slow speed performance. Did end up changing a few back EMF functions, and I can provide that information to anybody who would like it, but it was not the same on each unit. So This isn't kind of like some of my other decoders that I've ran into where you can just put the settings on it and it generally works pretty well. I'm actually having the same problem with the SD40-2s. They're becoming a little more difficult to tune than they have been in the past. The Gevos, the Dash 9s, the AC4400s, C39-8s, you could just dump these standard set of settings into them and they would all function exactly the same every time, as well as speed matching. Now, these did speed match with the same values. Uh, it just seems like the back EMF is a little bit different. And I may have a little insight into that when we start talking about the CSX unit behind it. Once I got that sussed out, I did similar to the SD40s where you mess with CV52 and 54 to get the back EMF settings set up a little bit. What I'm running into, though, is I would prefer a little bit better lighting capability. Personally, I take these to be switcher units. And switcher units need to have a little more capability in their lighting functions compared to a road unit. Now, you can definitely use these on the road, but I don't necessarily just want directional lighting. In consist, I want to have the ability to run both the front and the rear with lights on all the time, or have separate control of things. And so it can be done because I actually program all of my switching units to work this way. And this isn't just for Scaletrains. But when it comes to premium, high dollar stuff, this type of thing, in my opinion, should really be worked on and provided to the end user. Happy to give my little addition list to the function settings to anyone who wants to change it over. But I set up these units in such a way that using function 3 and function 4, I can individually control my lighting characteristics, and it allows them to function in a way that is, at least to me, much more scale. And that's something that I would like to see from more manufacturers. We kind of saw it with the road units where they were adding function 5. When you were running it at the back of the engine, you could have the dim headlight to act just like, a road engine does on modern rail. So better lighting features from the factory, I think, is something that the manufacturers need to look at moving forward, especially for these premium locomotives. The other gripe that I have is ran these for a very long period of time to make sure that they were good and reliable, and I did run into some issues. At above 20 scale miles per hour, these are hyper reliable. They run really good, they're smooth, they speed match well to each other, and you don't have a lot of coupler slack going on. The problem is, and I will tell you, it was rather frustrating to put together the pre-review run, they are electrically very sensitive to dirty track. And not really dirty track, just lightly dirty track. And I had been running into it a little bit. I kind of wanted to test something during my my run. I hooked up some of my old tank cars, which have very dirty wheels, and when moving through clean track, no problem, but just backing back through the dinge that those wheels would leave on track, which is minimal compared to dust and other things that you might pick up throughout a day, it was enough to get sound to sputter in a lot of places. So I've really put these through the ringer trying to get them through turnouts and stuff like that, and they do absolutely require very clean track. A lot of my modern Atlas units, I can set on speed step 1 and get them to crawl, quarter mile an hour scale speed through Cato number 6s. And if I'm a little bit faster than that, I can a lot of times get through a number 4 without any hiccup of the sound. And definitely no dropouts of, motor. These I had multiple times where I had dead engine. Also, something that I don't like to do, but it is kind of necessary with some, especially older stuff, you can kind of trick the system in your start and stop functionality. A lot of times when you're switching with these and you come up to a set of cars and you stop as you hit the cars, you'll end up with a dead engine. And I've had this happen on a lot of units. Sometimes it's just you need to get a little more wheel wear and it'll kind of go away. Didn't have that happen on these, at least yet. And kind of a way you could get around that is as you were coming in and you were slowing down, you would just switch directions of the engine So the back EMF settings are starting to turn the motor in the other direction and then bring it to 0. And a lot of times that would stop you from losing the engine at a stop. I tried that with these, and it was, in a lot of circumstances, the only way to keep the B unit running. The A unit is 95% of the time darn reliable. The B unit is much lower, like 50 to 60% of the time. So inconsistencies between the two is frustrating, especially for the price. So now we need to talk about the DC unit that I got and all the struggles I've had with it. I didn't mention it earlier, but I really have to say the trucks on this are a little more plasticky than, say, the painted ones and the others, but the color reproduction, I think this is pretty spot on for the stealth units. That CSX blue, I really think this is darn close, and I do really like the way these look. But I do want to talk about this unit because it has been a bit of a thorn in my side. Again, I purchased this unit as a DC version because currently you can only get DCC sound or DC units, and that's unfortunate. I think if you could get this DCC ready or DCC equipped, it would be a much better value proposition, especially for the price point this is at. But disassembly and installation of this DCC board that I have here is so difficult. I don't know that, I mean, this obviously qualifies as a DCC ready unit, but you need to be pretty capable in your understanding of how to do a DCC installation just to get the body back on. Not ruining something, putting this together is going to be very difficult for somebody who's inexperienced. And I feel like there maybe should be a slight warning on these things that DCC ready is not the same thing as Kato DCC ready. So when I first got this, I wanted to do the break-in on DC. I had not gotten my next 24 board yet. I don't have any of these in my backstock to put in for testing. So it took about a week longer to get this board. So I had been running on the DC board. I don't know if you'll be able to see this because it is incredibly small, but this is what the board looks like right out of the unit. And that is the new 24-pin Next 24 connector. The Next 18, in my understanding, all the times that I did an installation on it, it was very easy to align and very easy to snap into place. This one is not that way. It takes very, very fine alignment and a decent amount of seating pressure, and you can actually feel it click on both sides before it's well attached. But I had this unit breaking in on DC, and I generally run my 9-inch loop up top on DC for some short line stuff. And so that's where I was breaking it in just to make sure it was good and reliable. And I did notice it would really only run a long ways into the potentiometer throw. So it was taking a lot of start voltage to start to get moving. So a normal locomotive, at least in my experience, say you have a Kato controller, it does not take, an eighth of a turn into the full rotation of your potentiometer before the locomotive starts to move and overcome that initial. You kind of got to put enough power to the motor to overcome all of the friction inside the unit before it starts to move. This was over half before it started to move. You could then kind of bring it down a little bit and get some decent slow speed performance out of it, but it was odd to say the least. But I don't generally run on DC, so I was going to get a decoder in it because I've run into Kato units that didn't speed match well with other DCC controllers in them, or even on DC like units from the same batch. One would run way faster than another. You put a good decoder in them, and all of a sudden, they work like they're supposed to. So I get the decoder in, and that means it is time to disassemble the unit and put the decoder in. The disassembly process is okay, but some of the things you're going to run into is, if anybody is unaware, hopefully you can see this, This is a Microtrains coupler assembly. And anybody who has made the mistake of looking at these and going, holy cow, those are expensive, and then they see the unassembled version for half the price, and they purchase those without having the assembly jig, they then cry themselves to sleep that night because it is incredibly difficult to do without an assembly jig. These have a Microtrains-like coupler box in them, and I've got my components here. What you can see, if you were unaware, there is kind of the bottom chassis and the top plate that would hold the coupler arms in place. There's also a spring that goes between those coupler arms to provide tension, the realignment feature, as well as kind of holds everything in. You know, you got to be under a little bit of tension to be well coupled to something. Keeping that spring in place is impossible. The fitment of that coupler box into the pilot assembly, the hole right there, is so tight that you basically cannot get it out as a complete unit. And when you have to disassemble it, there is no possible way to keep that spring in there and have it pop out. I did wiggle them out, noticed that that was the style coupler they were. I've done this for a while, so I used my decoupling rod that I point with everything on here to kind of keep the spring in place as I forced those coupler boxes away from the chassis. Once you get the shell off, I was presented with a board that you may or may not be able to see on camera, but the screw sizes are different sized, as well as the forward screw is not fully seated. Try to get that a little better focus. So, in case there was any warranty questions that came up, I went through the most exhausting life process of installing this board without removing the main board from this chassis. It was next to impossible, and I hate myself for every minute of it. I would recommend that you obviously remove those two screws, remove the board, connect your decoder, and then obviously use some of the foam, as you can see under here, to create a pinch point between this and the board. That connector is not nearly as robust as the Next 18, and it absolutely requires something to hold it in place. You can breathe on that connector wrong and it will come off. That being said, I did actually loosen this screw up ever so slightly. From the factory, I think, and I don't know, I was having much difficulty getting this thing to run. I had issues on DC. When I installed this board, I could barely get it to move an inch before it would start to fail. I still get quite a bit of light flicker, so I'm not entirely sure that I have a good connection, but I have ohm checked all of my wires back to their points as best I can, and it seems like I have good connection to the rail. The thing that I'm running into, and I will see if I can just get this to slightly move, is I still have relatively jittery control, and there I already lost it. Well, that's not fair. This is relatively clean track. It's nothing that a good performing Atlas won't run on, and I'm still running into relatively regular dropouts. It would not run at all at speed. It will now, after loosening that center screw, because I think maybe the board was making some slight contact with the frame. It does run at a decent amount of speed, so 20 scale miles per hour or so, pretty consistently. I bought this to run with my CSX SD40-3. This was going to be a switching unit, and in its current configuration with a lock pilot board, it won't run. There's no way you could do switching work with this unit. There's just too many frequent dropouts for it to be reliable enough to do switching, even for a normal person that wouldn't necessarily care if sound was dropping out. This doesn't have sound. I don't appreciate the quality of this. this type of thing. They should be more consistent from the factory, especially for the price point these are coming in at. This mediocre slow speed performance thing that I'm seeing from modern Scaletrain stuff is something they need to address. The other problem, and why I don't think that this should be considered a DCC ready unit, I think there should be something else on it. The reinstallation of the shell with those sanding hoses, which I will admit are very cool, is so incredibly difficult. And I've done it a couple times now. It's tedious. It requires very fine handling and individually moving those brake hoses one at a time as you slowly slot the shell on like so. Can't really do it on camera. It is very much a two-handed operation, and you have to be very careful about doing it. So buyer beware. Purchase these with DCC and sound if at all you want to be running them on DCC. DC, you're fine, but just know that even in the future, when it comes time to do service, it's going to be very difficult getting these back together. I do want to talk a little bit about runnability before we go on to my recommendations. These have a couple of things that probably need to be addressed sooner rather than later. The brake hoses are badly designed. They look like normal microtrains. I have started trimming a lot of my brake hoses because when I go to grab a model and take it off of my track, I generally just pick it straight up and no problem. These units, due to the way that the brake hoses are angled, the height of them, as well as the angle that they're set at, I would consider trimming them back just a little bit so that this didn't happen. But you cannot disconnect the units from one another. Almost no matter what you do, up, down, left, right, or sideways, you have to twist them apart to get them to disconnect from one another. And when you are working with something this fine and well put together with lots of breakable parts, I do not want to be finagling them to get them to decouple when I'm taking them off of my layout. Now, there are some guys out there that store all their engines in a shed on their layout. Some of them are always MU'd together. Rock and roll, that's cool. But I will also say that disconnecting these is rather difficult. It can be done, and they do function better than some other couplers out there. But that is a major issue for me when it comes to the usability of these things. I don't want to break them handling them, so they need to come apart easily. The big problem that I'm running into with these is that they are switcher units. And so that brings me to what I would recommend. And if you're running DC, you might run into issues if you're trying to run multiple units MU'd together. The differences in the back EMF settings that I had to put in these units to get them to run together, as well as this one running poorly on DC and very poorly on DCC, I am willing to bet that I am probably going to have motor issues with these in the future, much like I did with some of my older Scaletrains units. I'm not sure that they've got the quality control quite sussed out yet. Most, and I would say 95% of all of my reliable older Scaletrains units, as well as some of my unreliable ones, all would use the same stock back EMF settings, as well as the same CV2, 6, and 5 for speed matching. These did speed match together with the same settings, but the back EMF was drastically different between the two. And that is kind of what will control the amount of voltage that has to be sent to a motor to get it to maintain certain speeds. Now, I realize it's more complex than that, but it's usually an indicator to me that there are problems. And so, unfortunately, I don't have the time on these units quite yet to suss that out, but I will keep everybody informed as I move forward. So I'm not sure if DC is going to be the answer for these. And when you get into the DCC sound, we're talking a big price point. And these are, in my opinion, switching units. Again, absolutely can be used on the road, but I'm kind of falling back into like the 2018 to 2020 series engines, where I was desperately searching for some 4-axle locomotives to run on my layout reliably. And getting through turnouts without dropouts was very difficult back then. So you generally found yourself just leaving the 4-axle units alone and jumping on a 6-axle unit to do your switching, which is fine, but everybody loves a good Jeep, and so I have for quite a while wanted a good, reliable Jeep. I'm starting to find that with the newer release Atlas stuff, and I hope to get into some of that stuff in the future, but these are just not reliable enough to do switching. They also don't have really good pulling power. Now, I don't know if this is a fair assessment. The older Atlas units, like the GP39M BNSF that I have, has a very loud drivetrain, but it does pull really well. But it's also 150% more heavy than these units. There is some criticism to be given, though. These particular units are exactly the same weight and have the same pulling power as my RS3 Atlases. Like I said, exactly the same, gram for gram. They pull just as well as those Atlases. As far as I can tell, they basically pull exactly the same amount. The difference is when you look at an RS3 versus a GP30, there's a massive difference in mass. Those Atlas units are little tiny RS3s and are packed with electronics and have the same amount of weight that these do, where I have lots of open space. There's a whole bunch of area in this particular frame where you could be adding weight. These units could be much better pullers if the entirety of their body was filled out with some sort of metal to give them the tractive effort. I understand that they're probably building this frame to be used in other models moving forward, but to me, these are primarily, or would primarily fit GP style units. I'm assuming that's what they're going to do. So basically from the GP30 all the way up to the GP60, there ain't a whole lot of difference in the way that this body would be structured. So I don't know why you couldn't have a little more weight in there. So I think this is kind of a bit of a missed opportunity to put together the premier switcher for N scale. Again, GP30s are excellent. I love GP30s. They're so cool. The different look really makes them stand out. But if these could outperform or even match the more modern Atlases with sound, somewhere around the 77 grams, where these are closer to like 64, anytime you're dealing with a grade, these are just going to struggle. And running them in consist definitely helps, but you can do the same thing with an Atlas, and it'll definitely do a lot more. The other thing you can do is you can run a more modern Atlas with an older non-sound one, kind of get the best of both worlds and increase your pulling power. You don't necessarily have the capability to run a slug, and this slug could be packed with more physical weight. This one weighs exactly the same amount as this one, and you could potentially get some extra pulling power using a slug. So again, I think it's a missed opportunity, and it's unfortunate. I don't know if it's the right time to purchase these units. I think we need to give it a little more time to see how the reliability susses out, and I have reached out to Scaletrains and have yet to get a response onto the inconsistency of the pickup issue. Now, I'll give them a few more days, and I'll make a post at some point discussing what we've been through, but the unit-to-unit reliability is bad, and I got these from 3 different places so that I could test, lots per se that went to different places. So at this point in time, if you want to run them as strictly a road unit, have them at speed all the time, and you're not terribly worried about the slow speed performance, they're beautiful, and frankly, they do sound pretty good, and I think they would work well in that role. I just wish that they were great in that role, as well as had super good, fine, low speed performance, so I could recommend them for all applications. if you strictly want to run these in a yard and do switching, slow speed stuff, they're not there yet. They struggle in number 6s, and they almost will not make it through a number 4 without a dropout. And frankly, I think that's subpar quality coming out of Scaletrains. These should be better for their price point. So currently, stay away from a DCC ready unit if you're going to put DCC in it, unless you're very capable in what you're doing. And I wouldn't spend my money on these if you're going to use them for switching. I'm going to hang on to these, probably use them as road units. But if I can get this functioning properly, I might keep it. Otherwise, I think the stealth unit unfortunately has to go. It just is not reliable enough to be a good switching unit, which is what I purchased it for on my layout. So with that said, thanks everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your week. I hope you found this informative, and hopefully it helps some people make some purchasing decisions. So appreciate y'all. Have a good week. Bye now.